Well, is 24 the new 50? A 2014 Canadian study undertaken by researchers at Simon Fraser University suggests so. The study surveyed over 3,300 volunteers aged between 16 and 44 and tested their cognitive abilities. The results were startling. For every 15 years after the age of 24, brain speed slowed down by about 15%. Yes, our brains slow down. Now, you might accept it as a common consequence of getting older, but you're about to discover how your mind can actually become sharp again. Our guest is one of the world's leading speakers on brain function, Dr. Arlene Taylor. Dr. Arlene Taylor, welcome to It Is Written. Tell us, what part of the brain is related to memory?
That is a very difficult question because to some degree, memory is diffuse throughout the brain. However, there are some parts of the brain that we've been able to, I'd say, locate some of the functions. So, for example, here's this amazing 3-pound universe that is the most complex organ in the universe. And the temporal lobe on each side has some what we call discrete memory banks, meaning that there are some memories that seem to get loaded in those two parts. We're learning that because people who have Alzheimer's, for example, and we do brain scans on them, and they are losing their memory for specific names and dates and people. The cells in these two temporal lobes are beginning to die. You learn a piece of information and it's in what we call short-term memory. If you want it to move into long-term memory banks so that it's sitting there like in a filing cabinet, if you will, and your hippocampus can access it when you need to know it, then that hippocampus needs to be really, really healthy so that it stores it, but almost as importantly, it can retrieve it. And you can think, the brain is something like a computer, although there's no computer on the planet that can do all the functions of the brain. But think of computer information. You type something into the computer. Now you have to give it a name, a file name. And hopefully you write that down somewhere. So if you want to go back, you can access that file and get that information. Well, in some ways, the brain is like that. You've probably filed information, but the brain has lost track of it. It doesn't have the label to pull it out. And sometimes that doesn't matter. Sometimes it matters. You may need that particular piece of information. Where do I live? What's my address? And if the brain isn't functioning right and you can't pull up that address, you may not be able to find your way home. You study geography. Now it's time for the geography test. And hopefully you've studied the material and rehearsed it and moved it to long-term memory, but you can now also quickly retrieve it when you need to know, tell me about the island of Newfoundland in Canada, for example. Well, hopefully you put something in your brain, but equally, hopefully, you can pull it up.
Dr. Arlene, you talk about education and continued learning as a way to age-proof your brain. Can you elaborate on that?
Research in 3 different countries has suggested from the research that for every year of education or its equivalent in brain stimulation beyond basic college, you reduce your risk of Alzheimer's by 20%.
Dr. Taylor, one of the best things we can do for memory, you say, is to take good care of our brains. How can we do that?
We can do that in any number of ways. Challenging it by learning new information is one of the ways. Playing is another way. Chaim Gonod said the work of children is play. And as a brain function specialist, I am concerned as I watch parents and educational systems putting lots of pressure on these little kids to excel, and they're having no time to play. We know, for example, that studying music builds pathways throughout all 4 of those cerebral chunks. But they need to love the music. And I've met many, many children for which learning music is drudgery. The teachers and their parents have not helped them have fun with the music. You need to play. There needs to be time for kids to go outside and do physical play. But adults need to play as well, and adults forget that. Well, long-term memory, I believe, is critical to a successful life. You know, there have been many studies of people who had brain injury and they have lost their long-term memory. And so the people taking care of them are exhausted. It's easy to become exhausted because you say to them, it's time to eat dinner, and they have no long-term memory. They can't even hold that in working memory long enough to get up and go to the table. Or you tell them a bit of information, they keep asking you the same question over and over and over again because their brain cannot hang on to the information and retrieve it. As you get older, you increase what's called intelligent memory. You know, there's several kinds of memory. There's the memory that says, I know who I am and I know my name and I can tell it to you. That's called declarative memory. There's the memory that you say, you know, I know how to ride a bicycle. I can't really declare to you specifically what all happens in my brain and body to let me ride a bicycle. That's more non-declarative, procedural memory, but I can do it.
Dr. Eileen, I notice you have some visual exercises. Can those help memory too?
Visual exercises can help brain function. It can help memory. You may remember, I don't know, if when you were young, you were trying to learn new words. My mother was a school teacher, so she would make me little flashcards, and she would hold them up, and as fast as I could say them, she'd put the card down. Okay, that's a type of visual exercise. So let's say there were some labels that you needed to learn about a certain topic, and you wanted them right at your tip of your tongue or your fingertips. You could make yourself some flashcards, and you could just look at them and quickly, you know, have something on there to prompt you, and then you come up with a label. And that would be a visual exercise that would be trying to lock that in memory. When you try to remember a telephone number, it's not so critical now with all our smartphones and iPhones, but I used to write down the number. In the process of writing down the number and looking at myself do that would help fix it in mind.
You also have people unscramble words. What does all that mean?
Well, here's the deal. You want brain stimulation, but every brain is different and every brain doesn't like the same thing. So somebody will say to me, well, I like to do crossword puzzles. That's all I do. And I'll say, well, that's good for your brain, but it is exercising one type of brain function, so you need to do several things. Now, I'm not particularly good at unscrambling words, but I have gotten on my smartphone, my iPhone, a little program called Whirlyword. And it gives me a scrambled, it'll give me 6 letters in a bunch of different, order. And I can whirl that to re-scramble them. And now I have to look at those words, and I have to come up with 3-letter words and 4-letter words and 5-letter words and sometimes a 6-letter word that just has given me little blanks. And that is very, very challenging. Do what you like. I tell people, I was being interviewed the other day and a man said to me, I hate pumping iron. And I said, so don't pump iron. Well, he says, I got to exercise my muscles. I said, there's lots of ways to exercise your muscles besides sitting there pumping iron. You can do pull-ups on a, metal bar. So if you want to keep doing it and have fun, remember, this is not drudgery, this is staying healthy for your whole life. Find what you like and then look for things that help you do that in a way that works for your brain, and it might be different for your brain than for my brain.
Dr. Taylor, you then encourage people to seek exercise, rest and relaxation while doing these things, right?
Well, everything starts and ends in the brain, Gary. And there are many people in today's world that are physically fairly healthy and their brain has taken a hike. And without a functioning brain, you can't do much with your physiology of your body. So I tell people, you've got to keep that brain healthy if you want to live for 122 years, 164 days with good mental function. And that means taking care of your brain. And what we've talked about are mental exercises, which are good for your brain, but you need physical. We've talked about that. You need to drink plenty of water. Your brain is more than 3/4 water. You need to have enough rest for your brain. You know, people don't understand what sleep does for their brain. During sleep, you consolidate what you learned the day before and move some of that into long-term memory. You repair your brain. You process all kinds of things. You dream. You dream in metaphor about what's happened to you. And you need good, solid nutrition. You know, unfortunately, in many countries, soft drinks have replaced water as the beverage of choice. And that's very unhelpful for your brain. I never, ever drink soft drinks. I never, ever drink diet drinks because they've got some sweeteners in them that I don't think are good for the brain. So water is my beverage of choice, and I want to eat good, healthy, complex carbohydrates, grains in as natural state as possible, legumes, nuts. The Blue Zone people, they eat some nuts every day. Not a lot because they are high fat, but they're good fat. And so, you know, I'll eat 12 or 15 nuts every day. Almost every day I have avocado because avocado is very good for brain function. Fruits, you know, come on, not junk.
Now, you also point out that stress can impact your memory. Can you share some more on that?
Well, first of all, what is stress? Stress is just living. You know, the absence of stress is death. So when people say to me, oh, I wish I could get rid of the stress in my life, I go, no, perhaps not, because I want to live a long time. So some stress is good. There are 3 main categories of stress. Eustress is good stress. Now, I am under eustress right now. You are putting me on the spot, asking me questions. But I love to talk about the brain, and as long as I perceive I can be successful, that's stimulating and good stress for my brain. And if you should ask me a question about which I absolutely know nothing, I am now healthy enough to say, Gary, I don't know anything about that. I'm willing to look it up and come back on the program, but right now I don't know enough to be coherent about it. And that's fine because nobody can ever know everything. There's distress. That's stress you want to avoid if all possible. Earthquakes, death of a family member, being fired, can't find a job, abusive relationships. You want to avoid that if possible. And then there's something called mistress. It's spelled M-I-S-S-T-R-E-S-S. And I put that extra S in there because the first time I said mistress in a seminar situation, a lady said, oh, I know about that. My husband's had several. And I said, well, I think if your husband had a mistress, that might be outright distress. Mistress is the stuff that happens to us every day that we don't realize is stressing the brain. Like, for example, hour after hour on the computer without getting up and moving around. Hour after hour reading the screen without looking away into the distance. Distress and mistress are very hard on the brain. And to the extent that you don't feel successful, you're discouraged about it, it can actually cause the brain to downshift. Meaning, instead of keeping your attention and energy up here in the thinking part, the conscious thought part of the brain, it gets pushed down to those automatic, repetitive types of activities in the brain. And then you don't have easy access to the prefrontal executive functions like morality, judgment, making decisions, willpower. And so unmanaged stressors can be very bad for the brain in that they don't let your brain function at the level that it could function. And you cannot be as consciously successful as you otherwise would be.
And Dr. Eileen, you have so many brain exercises that have biblical themes. You must think that Scripture can help in dealing with stress.
Well, let's put it this way. My father was a preacher. And so I grew up learning a lot of Scripture and hearing about stories in Scripture and hearing people call it a religious book. And I think, Gary, that Scripture is a book for everyday living, and we're only now, as we're getting brain function information, I think really being able to understand some of the Scripture. And when I learn brain function, Scripture just pops into my mind, like, be anxious about nothing, because now we know that anxiety is part of fear that derails your brain in terms of conscious thinking. And people who love to study Scripture, that's a great way to stimulate your brain. I had a man say to me the other day, you know, I just memorized 3 new Psalms. I said, great, that will be good for your brain. Rote memorization of material that is positive and helps you think positively is really good for your brain. But here's the deal. So you memorize 3 Psalms. If all you do is rehearse them, that will help you retrieve things from long-term memory, but it's not going to be stimulating for laying down new memory. So now you have to learn a new one. Yes, retrieve what you've already learned, but always keep learning something new. So one of the books that Dr. Briggs and I wrote together was Age-Proofing Your Memory Using Scripture. And we've got 4 different versions because different people like different things. But yes, it's helpful for your brain.
Now, you also emphasize that social interaction and good relationships can influence memory.
Well, there's an old saying, nobody is an island, and that's exactly right. Researchers don't always agree on everything about brain function, but we pretty much agree that whatever else the human brain is, it is spiritual, not necessarily religious. Religious is affiliation with an organization that espouses something you believe. But the brain is innately spiritual. It is innately sexual. And again, each of us is a sexual being, whether or not you are engaging in sexual behaviors. And the third thing is, we are relational. We need each other's brains with whom to interact and to stay sharp. And it's sort of tongue-in-cheek, but not really. You want to select friends with whom to hang out who are smart and who have a good sense of humor. And you can talk about ideas, you can play games together, you can have social intercourse as you eat, and that's very good for brain function.
So exercises like this can really make a difference.
They can make a difference. In fact, there have been some very interesting studies using people whose brains were not as sharp as they used to be. There was a group of graduate students, for example, that went into a retirement center, and they noticed lots of people sitting around in the lobby in wheelchairs, not interacting, not playing games, just sort of sitting there looking off into space. And they had the people's physicians come in and evaluate them to see if there was any condition for which they needed to be in a wheelchair, and if there was any organic brain problem that might not allow them to interact. So they had this large group of people, I think it was something like 40, and the doctor said there's no reason they're in a wheelchair, there's no reason they should not be able to be playing games and interacting. So these students came regularly to the retirement center. The first thing they did was get them out of the wheelchair and start walking them across the room. And for some of them, it took several days before they could really get back into doing much walking. And before long, they had them walking around the block with them and doing physical exercises. And then they started playing games. And they started doing the kind of mental exercises that we've been talking about. And then they started just interviewing them. Each person would take one of these older people and they would say, "Tell me about your childhood. What happened to you during childhood? Do you remember where you lived, where you were born?" And they would start remembering and talking about it. And by the end of that year, these people had probably improved, they guessed, back to about 14 years earlier in terms of physical movement and interacting and playing games and reading and talking to each other. And they were now working with other people because they just had this core group. They were now working with other people in the retirement center to do the same thing for them that the students had done. And it was amazing. And for several years, until the students were done with that program, they would regularly come back and interact with them, and they were vibrant and doing well. And then those students graduated, Gary. And a different group of students picked a different project. So there was nobody coming back to the retirement center to keep them enthusiastic about staying, well and alert. I would say 5 to 10 years later, this original group of graduate students decided to go back and see how they were doing. And they were distraught when they went back because many of them were back in their wheelchairs, just vacantly looking around the room. And some of them were interacting, and they said to them, "What happened?" And they said, "Well, when you were coming to visit every week, you kept us enthusiastic about doing this." And as the years went by, nobody was noticing how we were doing, and I guess we just got lazy. And I'm telling you, Gary, we can't afford to do that. So I have a core group of friends, and we have made a pact with each other that we will never let that happen to us. We are going to check on each other regularly. We are going to keep each other enthusiastic about staying healthy. That's one reason we developed Club 122 Longevity. We are going to that website and we are getting recipes and we're reading blogs and we're getting new information. We are going to stay enthusiastic. That's what relating to each other can do. We can keep each other engaged, Gary, and that's what it's going to take.
Dr. Eileen Taylor, you've shared some wonderful information with us today. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to have you on our program. I'd like to wish you God's blessing and all the very best in your endeavors.
And next time I see you, I probably will not just say, "Hello, Gary." I'll probably say, "Gary, how in the brain health are you?"